Here, from our perspective as a private equity fund investing in the sector, exciting times lie ahead for food and agribusiness in Africa. Several factors on the demand side, as you've mentioned, rising food demand globally and certainly in Africa as well. Commodity prices are spiking again, which has its own risk in terms of food security in this continent as well. But from an investor perspective, given that those commodity price rises is occurring in excess of input cost rises, means better margins and means better investment opportunities for food and agribusiness entrepreneurs and investors. Mm-hmm. Africa's cities are growing rapidly. Urbanization happens at a pace. The world is looking at Africa to a large extent to provide the next big step up in terms of food production. Mm-hmm. So several of these demand factors are driving the opportunity, and from the supply side, although there are major stumbling blocks still to overcome, from a productivity, infrastructure and agri-technology perspective, things are starting to happen. So we can see the supply and productivity of food and agribusiness activity in the continent improving.
When it comes to where exactly you're seeing the opportunity as a private investor, I mean, I came across an article where it mentioned that Agri-Vie is now acquired, 3,000 acres of land in Ethiopia, so that on a geographic basis. But in terms of farming category as well, where are those opportunities most lucrative as you see it right now?
We believe from a primary agriculture perspective, a lot of growth is happening and is about to accelerate in the Great Lakes region, in northern Zambia, in Nigeria. From a sector perspective or a subsector perspective, Agri is focusing on the food and agribusiness processing side of things. Our focus is regionally on East Africa and Southern Africa, with a limited exposure to the western side of the continent. Mm-hmm. So we see great opportunity for entrepreneurs and investors focusing on food processors that will be well positioned to supply the growing urban markets of Africa.
Exactly, because that consumer market becoming more and more of a highlight for the continent at this stage. Let's use Ethiopia though as a concrete example today, because we have the 2007 ban on exports of cereal still in place after the company temporarily banned those exports back in 2007 following the food crisis, and the ban had never really been formally lifted. Some have managed to bypass that ban. How much of a challenge does that pose for you and the businesses you're venturing into, if at all?
If we talk Ethiopia specifically, our specific focus there has been in partnering Ethiopian and Dutch partners in a tropical fruit juice processing company, where the company owns a farm, vertically integrates with processing and distribution, primarily for export markets, but with a secondary set of activities around producing and marketing to the local consumers in Ethiopia. Mm-hmm. So that in that instance, the particular area and the commodity is offering very attractive opportunities for entrepreneurs in the fruit juice processing sector, serving export markets in the Middle East and Western Europe. Yeah. And we partnered with entrepreneur and co-investors in that particular company.
What's the trend in this regard when it comes to protectionism? Because you highlighted that you export to quite a large extent, and there's already ongoing criticism over the export of food from countries that rely heavily on import food aid. And one can only assume that as food prices rise, with that demand-supply scale being tipped even more so, it's going to become more and more of a contentious issue. Mm.
You're quite right, and there has to be a balance. Local food demand is a big driving force in the business and investment opportunity. So is export parallel to that. Some countries in our investment geography have major needs in terms of earning foreign exchange, so sound export opportunities serve that developmental need as well. But you're quite right that a very large part of the opportunity is to serve the local demand and the local imperatives around food security of the cities and rural areas of the subcontinent.
Let's get into another contentious issue. As more reports of foreign land leases, especially in Ethiopia, surface, debate on the impact of these land deals on local farmers gets louder. I mean, what do you see being the role of a foreign investor and their involvement, which some say is the key to actually moving farming from subsistence to the commercial level?
I think the role of a private investor such as Agri-Vie in food and agribusiness, as far as the land issue is concerned, is to bring good practice into the investment space. There have been cases well documented in the public media around less ethical practices in securing land, often by foreign investors. Agri-Vie has a number of blue chip institutional investors from around the globe in the fund. Together with them, we're trying to, in our particular investment space, to set particular standards in terms of consultation, in terms of looking at the interests of the broad range of stakeholders when the companies that we invest own land. In many cases, these are land leases and not ownership, and there has to be a thorough process of consultation with local communities and other stakeholders where the development of the business involves expansion in land being cultivated for food production.
That on the land front, one would assume this also said to have a hefty impact in terms of skills development and job creation in those respective economies as well.
You're quite right. We have to bear in mind that primary as well as the processing side of things is, in most of the countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, the largest contributor to local GDP in all of these countries. So from a job creation perspective, this is the sector to look at for the future. And you're quite right in drawing the emphasis that in the final analysis, if the best infrastructure can be there can be investment capital, there can be a good regulatory and policy environment, but if the skills and the entrepreneurs and the human capital and the research and development is not there, then we're going to take a lot longer to close this gap in terms of performance of food and agribusiness in Sub-Saharan.
Another factor that could hinder development there, or the closing of that gap effectively, is there's increasing pressure, and we've seen it come through in Kenya most specifically, of listed agri companies hiving off land for commercial use to unlock value for shareholders. What are you making of that rising trend and the implications for agri development moving forward?
I wouldn't like to comment on specific instances. I'd like to come back to the general principle of the reality remains that Africa is the continent in the world with the largest potential in terms of arable land that is not cultivated. So it is not yet a zero-sum game. There is a lot of arable land that has not been utilized to date. So I think as long as the practices and the approaches that are applied live up to sustainability and equity to local communities, then I think there's a way to navigate through these issues.